This isn't the story of a hero. It's the story of a man betrayed. In 1967, the Kremlin needed a spectacular triumph for their 50th anniversary parade, and they didn't care about the cost. They had a ship they knew was a flawed coffin. They had a secret 10-page report detailing exactly how the pilot would perish, but they buried it. His best friend Yuri Gagarin desperately tried to stop the launch, but Vladimir Komarov flew anyway, for one secret, heartbreaking reason. In this video, we reveal the full, uncensored story. You will find out what Komarov really screamed at the men who sent him to his end, in a final, furious transmission that was hidden for decades. This was not an accident. It was a sacrifice. Stay with us to the very end to learn the horrifying truth. And if you believe these stories must be told, please subscribe to the channel, like this video if you find it powerful, and tell us your thoughts in the comments. You have to understand what 1967 felt like. It wasn't just another year on the calendar, it was the absolute white-knuckle peak of the us versus them mentality. The world was literally cleaved in two, split right down the middle by an iron curtain, and the only thing that really mattered to the superpowers was proving that their side, their ideology, their way of life was the right one. And the ultimate billboard for that proof? The final scoreboard? Space. The Soviets had owned the sky. They'd done it first. Sputnik, Laika, Gagarin, the first spacewalk. They had set the pace, and the Americans, frankly, were playing a frantic game of catch-up. But 1967 felt different. The momentum was shifting. The Americans were coming back, and they were coming back hard. Their new Apollo program, despite a horrific setback at the very start of the year that had shaken NASA to its core, was roaring to life. They weren't just aiming for orbit anymore, they were aiming for the moon. For the Kremlin, this was simply unacceptable. The Soviet Union wasn't just in the space race, they had started it. Losing the lead now, especially the race to the moon, was unthinkable. It would be a global humiliation. And then, there was the calendar. Oh, the calendar. Looming large in the fall was November 1967, the 50th anniversary of the great October Socialist Revolution. This wasn't just a holiday, it was the celebration, the golden jubilee of the entire Soviet experiment. The political leadership, Leonid Brezhnev and the whole apparatus, needed a triumph. They didn't just want one, they demanded one. They needed a staggering, headline-grabbing spectacle to paste across the front page of Pravda and broadcast to the world. What could possibly be bigger, more symbolic than a new, grand achievement in space? They envisioned a cosmic ballet. Launch one spacecraft, then, a day later, launch another. Have them meet in the heavens, dock, exchange crews. A true union in orbit. It was ambitious, it was cinematic, and it would be the perfect symbolic victory. The program even had a new, powerful name for this magnificent spacecraft. Soyuz, the Union. It sounded brilliant on paper. But here's the rub, the one that everyone in a uniform or a lab coat understood. Space exploration doesn't care about anniversaries. It doesn't bend to political schedules. It cares about physics. It cares about mathematics, pressure tolerances, and thousands upon thousands of individual components working in perfect, flawless harmony. The engineers knew the Soyuz wasn't ready. The cosmonauts, whispering in their training facilities, definitely knew it wasn't ready. But how exactly do you say no to the Kremlin when they're planning the party of the century? The pressure wasn't just professional, it was suffocatingly patriotic. To voice doubt wasn't just pessimism, it bordered on disloyalty. The atmosphere in the Soviet space program wasn't just charged, it was toxic. It was a pressure cooker with the safety valve deliberately welded shut. And into this impossible, no-win situation, they pushed a new, complex, and dangerously untested machine. The clock was ticking, not towards a moment of technical readiness, but towards a date on a calendar. That right there is how this whole tragedy really began. Not with a faulty wire or a bad calculation, but with a deadline. In the design bureaus, the air wasn't celebratory. It was thick with a kind of quiet, technical dread. The Soyuz spacecraft was a thing of marvel, a generational leap. It wasn't the simple, reliable tin can that had carried Gagarin or Tereshkova. This was a sophisticated, multi-part vessel designed for the real work of space: rendezvous, docking, crew transfers, and long-duration flights. It had an orbital module, a service module, a descent capsule. It was a true station in miniature. But with all that complexity came an exponential number of things that could go wrong. And they were going wrong, constantly. The political bosses in Moscow saw the shiny mock-ups and the ambitious mission plans. The engineers saw the telemetry data from the unmanned tests, and it was giving them nightmares. The program had been plagued by a series of catastrophic and very much classified failures. The first unmanned test, Cosmos 133, had been a disaster. The plan was to launch it, then launch a second one to dock with it. But the second craft's launch was scrubbed, and then Cosmos 133 itself went haywire. Its orientation system failed, it started burning through its propellant at an alarming rate, and when they finally tried to bring it home, it missed its re-entry window and was heading straight for China. The self-destruct system had to be activated. Boom. Just like that. Then came the next attempt, a launch failure on the pad. But the real red flag, the one that should have stopped everything, was Cosmos 140. It actually made it to orbit, which was a start, but then the gremlins came out. The automatic orientation system failed again. The craft tumbled. They managed to wrestle it back toward Earth, but the re-entry was brutal. It came in too steep. And then the final insult. A depressurization plug in the heat shield burned through, scorching the capsule's interior. When it finally slammed into the frozen Aral Sea, it sank. Divers had to recover a capsule that was never, ever supposed to be breached. The engineers, led by the legendary designer Vasily Mishin, who had inherited the impossible burden of succeeding the late, great Sergei Korolev, were looking at a mountain of unresolved issues. We're not talking about loose screws or sticky buttons. We're talking about fundamental flaws. The list was terrifyingly long. The navigation system was unreliable. The parachute system, the one system you absolutely cannot have fail, had not once been successfully tested in the way it would be used, from a high-altitude drop. The main chute was packed so tightly into its container that engineers were deeply worried it wouldn't be able to deploy properly. There were hundreds of documented malfunctions, from the solar panels to the communication gear. The ship was, in blunt engineering terms, a death trap. This data was presented, reports were filed, meetings were held, but the schedule was more than a schedule. It was a monolith. It was the 50th anniversary. It was Brezhnev. It was the imperative to beat the Americans. The engineers would say, the parachute container is flawed. The political supervisors would hear, you are lacking in Soviet spirit. The technicians would report, the orientation system is unstable. The managers would reply, failure to meet the deadline is not an option. It was an impossible dialogue. They were speaking two different languages, the language of physics and the language of political loyalty. In this brutal equation, loyalty was mandated to win. The pressure was so immense that engineers and technicians were ordered to sign off on inspection reports, to put their names on documents that declared the Soyuz flight-ready, even as their hands shook. They were painting over the cracks, knowing that a man's life would depend on that faulty paint job. The Soviet public, of course, saw none of this. They were masters of reading between the lines, but the state-controlled press gave them nothing to read. When a mission went perfectly, it was a Soyuz or a Vostok, flown by a hero whose face was plastered on posters overnight. When it failed, it simply vanished. Or, more cleverly, it was laundered. The catastrophic test flights, the ones that tumbled out of control or burned up on re-entry, were quietly given the anonymous Cosmos designation. They were presented to the world as successful, dull scientific satellites measuring cosmic rays or magnetic fields. It was a brilliant, cynical piece of propaganda. While engineers at the Baikonur Cosmodrome were figuratively sweeping up the digital wreckage of another failed Soyuz test, Pravda would be dutifully reporting that Cosmos 139 has successfully completed its mission. But you can't hide a tumbling, multi-ton spacecraft from the men who were supposed to fly it. The Cosmonaut Corps, especially the senior detachment, men like Yuri Gagarin, German Titov, and Andrei Nikolaev, were not fools. They weren't just pilots, they were highly trained engineers. They sat in on the debriefings, they read the telemetry reports, and what they saw chilled them to the bone.
This wasn't a single, isolated problem. It was a pattern. It was a systemic sickness. The orientation system wasn't just buggy, it was fundamentally unstable. The communications were patchy, the power systems were inadequate. The real terror, however, was the one thing that had to work last: the parachute. This was the final, non-negotiable handshake with survival, and it was a complete unknown. The design was new, and the descent capsule's aerodynamics were complex. But because of the relentless schedule, they had skipped the crucial high-altitude test drops. They had no real-world data to prove the main chute would even come out of its container, let alone deploy correctly. This is where the story gets a new, desperate character. A mid-level engineer named Veniamin Rusayev, who had worked directly on the Soyuz systems, was so appalled by what he saw, by the shortcuts, the shoddy workmanship, the sheer denial, that he did the unthinkable. He broke chain of command. Rusayev compiled a dossier, a meticulous 10-page report that was essentially a eulogy written in advance. He detailed the critical design flaws, the unstable attitude control, and, most damningly, the parachute system. He described it as coarse and unreliable, pointing out that the tightly packed chute, subjected to the vacuum and temperature swings of space, was almost guaranteed to fail. He knew this report would be a career ender, maybe worse. He tried to get it to Brezhnev's inner circle, to the political bosses, but it was blocked at every level by managers who refused to be the bearers of bad news. Desperate, Rusayev saw one last chance. He found a sympathetic friend in the KGB assigned to Star City, the cosmonauts' training center, and gave him a copy. That agent, in a moment of conscience, passed the report to the one man who couldn't be ignored, Yuri Gagarin. Suddenly, the weight of the world wasn't just on the engineers, it was on the first man in space. Gagarin now held in his hands a technical confirmation of every dark whisper and every gut-wrenching fear he and his colleagues had shared. The warnings were no longer just rumors, they were documented, signed, and sitting on his desk. The unpublicized failures had just found their voice. If the Soviet space program had a face, it was Yuri Gagarin. He was the smile, the charm, the global icon. But if the program had a spine, it was Vladimir Mikhailovich Komarov. He was not like the others. Komarov was older, 40 years old in 1967, which made him a veritable elder in the Cosmonaut Corps. He wasn't a hotshot fighter jock with a rebellious streak. He was a qualified engineer, a family man with a wife, Valentina, and 2 children. He was quiet, introspective, and methodical. He'd already flown, commanding the very first multi-person crew on Voskhod 1. He was, in short, the ultimate professional. He was the man you called when the mission was complex, delicate, and required an ironclad discipline that wouldn't crack under pressure. And that is exactly why he was assigned to Soyuz 1. The mission was seen as the most complex, most critical flight in Soviet history, and they needed their best, most reliable hand at the wheel. Komarov knew the Soyuz was a mess. He didn't just suspect it, he knew. He had been part of the engineering reviews. He had seen the same data as the technicians. He was friends with the engineers who were being forced to sign off on systems they didn't trust. But Komarov was also a product of his system, a soldier, a patriot, and a man who understood the chain of command. You did not question orders from the top, not when the 50th anniversary was on the line.
The dynamic became truly agonizing because of one man, his backup, Yuri Gagarin. Gagarin and Komarov were close friends. They hunted together, they drank together, they talked, and they trusted one another implicitly. When Gagarin got his hands on that damning 10-page report from Rusayev, the one detailing the coarse parachute and the dozens of other flaws, he didn't go to the generals. He went straight to Volodya. The confrontation, whispered about for decades since, must have been excruciating. You have to picture it. Two friends, the two biggest heroes of the program, huddled in a room in Star City. Gagarin, the emotional, fiery one, is pacing, possibly throwing the report on the table. "You can't go," he would have insisted. "It's a death trap. Look at this. The parachute will fail. The orientation is unstable. They're sending you up there to perish." Gagarin was a global hero. He had clout. He was shouting at officials, demanding the launch be scrubbed, trying to use every ounce of his fame to stop the machine. And Komarov? Komarov just sat there, disciplined, stoic. He knew everything Gagarin was saying was true, but he also knew something else, a dreadful, fatal piece of logic. If he, the primary pilot, refused to fly, the mission wouldn't be scrubbed. The Kremlin would never allow that. They would simply solve the problem. They would ground Komarov in disgrace, call him a coward, strip him of his rank, and send the backup pilot. The backup was Yuri Gagarin. This was Komarov's trap. He was looking at his best friend, the first man in space, a man he loved like a brother, and he knew, if I don't go, you will. Komarov could not, under any circumstances, allow Gagarin to take his place on that doomed flight. He couldn't live with himself. And so he made a calculated, horrifying choice. He would go. He would fly the broken ship, knowing it was almost certainly a one-way trip, precisely because he was the disciplined pilot. His final act of discipline was to protect his friend. "I'm not backing out," he would have told Gagarin, his voice firm. "The mission will proceed." He accepted his assignment, not as a hero charging into glory, but as a man walking, clear-eyed, to his own end to save the man standing next to him. Yuri Gagarin didn't just walk out of that room with Komarov, he stormed. The stoic, fatalistic acceptance from his friend had broken something inside him. The first man in space, the living embodiment of Soviet triumph, was now a man possessed by a terrifying, impotent rage. He was no longer just a colleague. He was a friend watching a murder being meticulously planned. His distrust, once a quiet murmur of technical concern, had metastasized. It was no longer about a faulty ship. It was about a rotten system, a bureaucracy that saw its heroes as expendable fuel for a political celebration. He had to do something. He was Gagarin. If he couldn't stop this, who could? He went straight for the top. He bypassed the mid-level managers and went directly to the senior officials overseeing the mission. Reports vary on who exactly he confronted. Some say it was General Kamanin, the iron-fisted head of the Cosmonaut Corps. Others say he even tried to get to Brezhnev himself. But the consensus is this: Gagarin, the charming icon, vanished. In his place was an insubordinate, furious officer. He wasn't subtle. He was shouting. He was waving Rusayev's 10-page report, the one that might as well have been Komarov's death warrant, slapping it on the polished tables of men who hated bad news. "This is a coffin," he allegedly yelled. "You were sending a man to his end, and you know it. The parachute will not work. The navigation is blind. Are you going to just sit there and watch this happen for the 50th anniversary?" The reaction was exactly what he should have expected, and it broke his heart. He wasn't met with counter-arguments or technical debates. He was managed. He was patronized. He was the golden boy having a tantrum. They told him, "Yura, you are overwrought. You are letting your friendship with Volodya cloud your judgment." They reminded him that the State Commission had signed off, that the engineers, the very ones he knew had been strong-armed, had given their approval. They wrapped their refusal in the flag, telling him his duty was to support the mission, to show unity, to be the smiling hero everyone needed him to be. He realized in that cold, official room that his fame was a hollow shell. He could open any door in the world except the ones that mattered. He was a symbol, and symbols aren't allowed to have opinions. The entire apparatus moved to the Baikonur Cosmodrome for the launch. The desert air was thick with unspoken dread. Gagarin, as the backup, had to be there for every final check, every suit-up test. He had to shadow Komarov, and it was eating him alive. He tried one last desperate, chaotic maneuver. On launch day, April 23, 1967, as Komarov was being led out to the transport bus, Gagarin, already in his own spacesuit, intercepted him. It was a complete and stunning breach of protocol. He was loud, he was emotional. He wasn't just wishing his friend goodbye, he was demanding to fly. He insisted that he should go, that Komarov should stand down. Was he trying to take his friend's place, as Komarov had feared? Or was he trying to create such a disturbance, such an unacceptable last-minute crisis, that the launch controllers would have no choice but to scrub the mission? It was an act of pure desperation. The launch officials were horrified. They had to physically separate them, pulling Gagarin away from his friend, reminding him of his position. Gagarin finally relented, but he was crushed. He had failed. He was forced to stand down, and all he could do was watch as his best friend, Vladimir Komarov, walked away to board the machine that they both knew was a trap. The aftermath of the confrontation with Yuri was a deafening silence. The chaotic, desperate energy vanished, replaced by the sterile, procedural hum of the launch protocol. Vladimir Komarov, encased in his bright orange SK-1 spacesuit, was a man apart. He sat on the transport bus, rumbling across the dusty roads of the Baikonur Cosmodrome, and he must have felt an isolation so profound it was almost physical. He was surrounded by technicians and officials, but he was utterly alone. They were all participants in a grim, shared performance. They avoided his eyes, not out of malice, but out of a collective, unbearable shame. They knew. He knew they knew. And yet, the bus rolled on. He was focused. His mind was no longer on the politics, the anniversaries, or even his friend's desperate, furious face. His mind was in the machine. He was an engineer, a pilot, and he was mentally running through the checklists, the failure points, the contingencies. He wasn't thinking about if the spacecraft would fail, he was calculating when and what his precise response would be. If the solar panel doesn't deploy, I lose power, so I must prioritize manual orientation for re-entry. If the orientation system fails, I must use the Visor optical device to align manually.
His brain was a cold, clear instrument, processing the hundreds of faults that Rasayev's report had warned about, transforming them from a death sentence into a complex, high-stakes engineering problem. They reached the launch pad. The rocket, his R-7 booster, was a towering white obelisk, venting clouds of supercooled oxygen, steaming and hissing in the pre-dawn darkness as if it were alive. It was a beautiful, terrifying sight. This part was reliable. This part, the Semyorka, was the workhorse that had never failed them. The problem was the tiny, flawed payload it was carrying. He walked to the gantry elevator, his suit cumbersome. He gave the traditional wave to the launch crews, a final, steady gesture of professionalism. The ride up the gantry was slow, metallic, and lonely. The wind howled across the open steppe. Inside the Soyuz capsule, it was impossibly tight. It smelled of ozone, filtered air, and new plastic. The technicians, their faces grim, performed the final checks, strapping him into the Kazbek couch, connecting his comms and life support umbilicals. Every strap tightened, every plug clicked into place was another link in the chain. "All systems nominal," someone's tinny voice said in his helmet. He would have responded with a crisp, "Ready." Then, the last human faces pulled back. The heavy hatch was lowered into place. The sound of it closing, a dull thud, followed by the metallic clank and whir of the locking mechanisms,
was the sound of the world being sealed away forever. He was alone. Just the hum of the gyroscopes, the hiss of the air circulator, and the ominous creaks and groans of the colossal rocket beneath him settling under its own immense weight. The countdown, a disembodied voice in his ear, was relentless. Miles away, in the subterranean control bunker, the air was unbreathable. General Kamenin, Vasily Mishin, and a silent, seething Yuri Gagarin watched their consoles. No one was celebrating. They were all hostages to the schedule. Pusk! Ignition was not a sound. It was an earthquake. A low, deep vibration shook his very bones, instantly escalating into a deafening, all-consuming roar. The rocket beneath him exploded to life. He was slammed back into his couch by a colossal, invisible hand. His vision blurred, his chest compressed, the G-forces squeezing the breath from his lungs. "Left off," he managed to grunt, his voice strained but impossibly calm. "The vehicle is stable. All systems are normal." From the outside, it was a perfect launch. A pillar of fire ripped through the Kazakh night, a flawless ascent. But inside the bunker, every engineer knew the launch wasn't the test. It was just the opening act. The real, terrifying test was just beginning. The roar of the ascent gave way to an almost disturbing quiet. There was the familiar, gentle hiss of the air circulation system, the clicking of relays, and then nothing. He was floating, weightlessness. For a moment, it was the perfect, serene reward for the violence of the launch. Vladimir Komarov was in orbit, the third stage of the rocket falling away below him, a clean separation. He was Rubin, a ruby glinting in the blackness. His eyes scanned the instrument panel, his engineer's mind moving crisply through the post-insertion checklist. The automatic sequences were firing, antennas deployed, systems came online. And then came the moment for the spacecraft to unfurl its wings, the two large blue-black solar arrays that were essential for generating power. He heard the mechanical thud and whir of the pyrotechnic bolts firing and the motors engaging. On his console, a series of green lights should have lit up. One did. The starboard, right panel. It was open, and the amp meter needle for it flickered and climbed, showing it was alive and drinking in the sun. The other side of the panel, the port, left side, was dead. The light stayed dark. The needle for its power generation remained flatlined at 0. Komarov's heart didn't stop. It didn't pound. It just went cold. He stared at the indicator for a long, silent second. This wasn't a faulty sensor. This was real. He was a professional pilot, and he knew instantly what this meant. The spacecraft wasn't just impaired, it was crippled. The Soyuz was designed to run on the power from 2 panels. With only one, he was operating on less than half power. The batteries, which were only meant for temporary use during darkness or re-entry, were now draining, trying to make up the massive deficit. The clock had started ticking. "Zarya, this is Rubin," he said, his voice a perfect monotone, betraying nothing. "I am in orbit. Separation was clean." He paused. "I have a systems anomaly. The port solar array has failed to deploy. I repeat, port array is not deployed. I show 0 amperage." In the bunker, a wave of sickness washed over the room. This wasn't a minor glitch. This was one of the exact failure points the engineers had warned about. The panel was jammed, stuck fast against the service module. It was the first domino. The mission's ambitious plan, the rendezvous, the docking, the crew transfer, evaporated in that instant. The only mission now was recovery. "Rubin, this is Zarya," a voice crackled back, suddenly tense. "We copy. Stand by." They scrambled. Their first, desperate thought was that it was just stuck. Maybe the mechanism was stiff. "Rubin, we want you to try and jolt it free. Use the manual orientation thrusters. Give us sharp, short bursts. Rock the spacecraft. Let's see if we can shake it loose." Komarov did as he was told. He toggled the manual controls and fired the thrusters. Pft, pft, pft. The Soyuz shuddered violently around him, an unnatural, jarring motion. He was shaken in his couch, but his eyes never left the panel. The needle didn't move. The light stayed dark. He pitched the spacecraft, yawed it, trying to use the physics of the rotation to pop it free. Nothing. He fired the thrusters again. Still nothing. The stuck panel was a dead weight, a symbol of all the shortcuts, all the reports that had been ignored. And as he fired the thrusters, wasting precious propellant, he noticed something else. The power drain from the malfunctioning automatic orientation system was already fighting him. The ship was becoming unstable. The first failure was now actively, greedily, giving birth to the second. This was the nightmare scenario. The failed solar panel wasn't just a single broken part, it was a severed artery. Komarov watched, helpless, as the power levels on his main battery bus began to drop. It was no longer a slow drain, it was a hemorrhage. The ship's systems, all designed to run on the ample power of 2 arrays, were now desperately sucking life from the batteries that were only ever meant to last a few hours, to get him through the Earth's shadow, not to power an entire mission. "Zarya, this is Rubin," he reported, his voice still a mask of calm, but the ground controllers could hear the new sharp edge of urgency. "Power drain is critical. I am losing the main bus, requesting permission to go to emergency power down." The order came back instantly. "Rubin, approved. Power down all non-essential systems, all non-essential. We need to save the batteries for re-entry. Repeat, save the batteries for re-entry." Komarov's gloved fingers flew across the panels. Click. The cabin comfort heaters went cold. Click. The secondary telemetry transmitters went silent. Click. The main cabin lights died, plunging him into a sudden deep gloom, lit only by the faint green and red glow of the essential instrument panels. The Soyuz instantly became a cold, dark, and deeply lonely place. And then the other monster came out of the closet. The automatic orientation system, the complex electronic brain that was supposed to keep him stable, began to fail. This was the second critical flaw the engineers had warned about. The system used sensors, ion sensors and infrared sensors, to lock onto the Earth and the Sun to know which way it was pointing. But these sensors were delicate. They needed stable power to function, and the power was now fluctuating wildly. Worse, the stuck solar panel was acting like a rudder, creating an unbalanced drag that the system had not been designed to compensate for. The system went insane. It could no longer find its lock. The Soyuz, no longer under stable control, began to drift. Then it began to tumble. Komarov could feel it, a slow, sickening, disorienting spin. The automatic system, in a panic, tried to correct it. It began firing the attitude control thrusters. They fired erratically in all directions, burning precious, irreplaceable propellant. This was the cascade. The failing power system was killing the orientation system. The failing orientation system was now accelerating the power drain with its frantic, useless commands, and it was wasting the propellant he would need to manually aim the craft for re-entry. It was a perfect, vicious circle of failure. "Zarya, the automatic system is non-responsive." Komarov's voice was sharp now. "It is firing thrusters erratically. The spin is increasing. I am deactivating it." "Copy, Rubin. Go to manual control. Manual control." He switched it off. The thrusters went silent, but the spin remained. He was now alone, in the dark, in a cold, power-starved capsule that was slowly, inexorably, tumbling end over end. He was no longer a passenger in an advanced spacecraft. He was a 19th century sailor in a storm, clinging to the wheel, with no stars to guide him. His only hope was the vzor, a small optical periscope, his window. He would have to unstrap, float in the darkness, and press his eye to that tiny viewport. He would have to find the Earth manually, just a sliver of blue and white in the black, and, using hand controls, fire the thrusters himself to stop the spin. It was an almost impossible task, and he had to do it while his power, his fuel, and his time bled away.
It was one thing to switch to manual control. It was another thing entirely to perform it. Komarov unstrapped himself from the couch, his body floating free in the freezing, pitch-black cabin. The only light came from the dim red glow of the instrument panel, and it wasn't enough to see by. He was flying by feel. He propelled himself forward to the Vzor periscope, the tiny optical port that was now his only connection to the universe. He pressed his helmet against it, his breath fogging the internal glass. What he saw was chaos. It wasn't the serene, majestic Earth of Gagarin's flight. It was a dizzying, sickening smear of blue, white, and black. The Soyuz was tumbling, and through the narrow viewport, the planet, the moon, and the blinding white sun were whipping past in a chaotic, repeating kaleidoscope. The spin was disorienting. He couldn't get a bearing. He was an astronaut, an engineer, a pilot, and he was profoundly, terrifyingly lost. His hands found the manual thruster controls. He had to feel the spin and fire the jets to counteract it. It was like trying to balance a spinning plate on a stick in the dark while wearing mittens. He gave a short burst. Pfft. The spin axis shifted, becoming a wobble. The Earth careened past the Vzor at a new, sickening angle. He overcorrected. Perf, perf. He was sweating now, the cold of the cabin irrelevant inside his suit, which was now struggling to process the humidity of his panic. "Zarya, I cannot get a lock," he transmitted. "The spin is complex. The transmission dissolved into a high-pitched shriek of static. He slammed his fist against the comms panel, a useless human gesture. It wasn't the panel. The tumbling had pointed his low-power antenna away from the ground. But even as he fought, he knew a worse silence was coming. His orbital track was carrying him away from the Soviet Union, out over the vast emptiness of the Pacific Ocean. He was entering the dark side of the orbit, both literally and figuratively. The static hissed, popped, and then died. The silence was absolute. It was a physical weight. The only sound in his entire universe was the hiss of his own oxygen circulator and the pounding of his own heart in his ears. He was alone. For the next 50 minutes, no one on Earth could hear him. No one could help him. He was a ghost, tumbling through the void. He did not stop working. He continued to fight the spin, tapping the thrusters, trying to find a purchase, an anchor point, anything. He watched the battery levels. They were now in the red. He saw, in the faint red glow of his panel, a spider web of ice crystals forming on the inside of the hatch near the metal locking mechanism. It was now well below freezing inside the capsule. His hands, even in the gloves, were beginning to ache with a deep, penetrating cold. He wrestled with the controls, minute after agonizing minute, alone in the silence. Then, a blinding flash. The sun. It exploded into his visor, a searing white fire that forced him to recoil. Sunrise. He was coming back. Back over the horizon, back toward home. His fingers flew to the comms panel. Zarya, this is Ruben. Do you read? Do you read me?" The static cracked. A faint voice, buried in noise, clawed its way through. Ruben, we read. Report your status." Komarov's voice was hoarse, strained. "Zarya, I have partial stabilization, but the power is critical. I am reading 18%. I am very cold. The automatic landing system it's gone. It has no power. I will have to do it myself. I will have to orient the ship for re-entry, manually." While Komarov was fighting for his life, tumbling in the freezing dark, another, equally tense drama was unfolding on the ground. The entire mission, the grand 50th anniversary spectacle, wasn't just Soyuz 1, it was a two-ship ballet. Miles away from Komarov's empty launch pad, another R-7 rocket stood fully fueled and ready on Pad 31. Inside a nearby bunker, Three more cosmonauts, Valery Bykovsky, Alexei Yeliseyev, and Yevgeny Krunov, were already in their spacesuits, preparing to board Soyuz 2. Their mission, to launch, rendezvous with Komarov, dock, and then, in a stunning display of new capability, Yeliseyev and Krunov would perform a spacewalk, transferring from their ship to Komarov's. This was the plan. This was the glorious headline. But in the main control bunker, the plan was poison. The room was divided. On one side, you had the engineers and the cosmonauts, Gagarin chief among them, who were staring at the telemetry from Soyuz 1 with absolute horror. Komarov was crippled. He had no power, no stabilization, and was freezing. To launch another ship, a ship they knew was built with the exact same flaws, the same parachute, the same unstable systems, was not a rescue. It was a suicide pact. It was sending 3 more men into the same trap. On the other side, you still had the political commissars. Their grand anniversary show was dying on the vine. A new, frantic, and utterly reckless idea was born. Could Soyuz 2 launch on a rescue? Could they get up there, get close enough, and somehow have Komarov jump from his ship to theirs? It was a movie plot fantasy. It was impossible. The Soyuz had no docking mechanism that could be used with a tumbling, powerless craft. It had no mechanism for an emergency external transfer. It was madness. The argument raged, but the data from Komarov was the loudest voice in the room. His ship was a coffin. Then, fate offered the politicians an escape. A new report came in. The weather over Baikonur, which had been clear for the Soyuz 1 launch, was turning. Thunderstorms, high winds, a massive weather front was rolling in. This was the out they needed. It wasn't an admission of catastrophic engineering failure. It wasn't admitting that Rusayev's report was right. It was the weather. The final decision was made, not with a bang, but with a defeated sigh. General Kamanin gave the order. The launch of Soyuz 2 was scrubbed. They couldn't risk a launch in the storm. The party was officially over. The order was relayed to Pad 31. Bykovsky, Yeliseyev, and Krunov, confused and frustrated, were told to stand down. They unsuited, unaware that a weather front had just saved their lives. In the main bunker, the mood turned funereal. The frantic energy of managing 2 missions vanished. There was only one mission left. The cancellation of Soyuz 2 was the final, unstated admission. There would be no rendezvous. There would be no rescue. There would be no triumph. Komarov was now officially, completely, and irrevocably alone. He was a single, dying satellite, and all the Soviet Union could do was listen and wait for him to fall. The control bunker was a tomb. The cancellation of Soyuz 2 had sucked all the air out of the room, replacing the frantic energy of the launch with the quiet, helpless vigil of a hospital waiting room. They were no longer mission controllers, they were pallbearers in waiting. Yuri Gagarin sat at a console, his face ashen, listening to the voice of his friend filter through the static. That voice was the only thing in the universe that still had any agency. It was calm, it was working. Zarya, Komarov's voice crackled, impossibly steady. I am on orbit 18. Battery levels are critical. I estimate one more orbit is impossible. The re-entry must be on this pass. I am preparing for manual retrofire. Manual retrofire. The words hung in the air. This wasn't just stopping the spin. This was a feat of space piloting that had never been attempted, let alone under these conditions. The automatic re-entry system, the complex brain that was supposed to calculate the angle, the trajectory, and the burn time, was dead. It was just a block of cold, useless electronics. Komarov had to do its job. He had to align the Soyuz perfectly backwards, pointing the main engine in the direction of flight. He had to hold it there, stable, and fire the engine for a precise number of seconds. If his angle was too steep, he would incinerate in the atmosphere, a man-made meteor. If it was too shallow, he would skip off the atmosphere like a stone on a pond, bounced back into a useless, unrecoverable orbit where he would wait for the air and power to run out.
He was in darkness again, coming over the Pacific. He couldn't see the horizon. He couldn't see anything. He had to wait. "Zarya," he reported, "I am in shadow. I cannot get an alignment. I am waiting for the dawn. I will attempt visual orientation as I cross the terminator. Stand by." He waited, floating in the frozen black cabin. He was holding the manual controls, his only connection to his own fate. Then it came, a blinding, silent explosion of light, the sun. It hit the Soyuz and the tiny Vzor periscope, illuminating the cabin with a sudden, brilliant, angelic light. Through the viewport, he saw it, the majestic, razor-thin, electric blue line of the Earth's atmosphere, the Dawn Terminator. His hands, stiff with cold, moved on the controls. This was it. He had maybe 15 minutes. He fired the thrusters. Poof! The craft yawed. He saw the blue line drift in the Vzor's crosshairs. Poof, poof, he countered, nudging the massive, unstable ship. He wasn't just stopping the spin, he was aiming a multi-ton bullet, using only his eyes, his hands, and his iron will. He ignored the non-existent automatic systems. He ignored the freezing cabin. He ignored the alarms that were now screaming about his low battery. He flew the ship. In the bunker, they watched their screens, breathless. The telemetry for the ship's orientation, which had been a chaotic scribble, suddenly stabilized. It locked on to the perfect re-entry attitude. The machine hadn't fixed itself. The man, the last line of defense, had become the system. He was the gyroscope. He was the computer. "Zarya, I have orientation," Komarov's voice transmitted, strained with the effort of holding the unstable craft steady. "I am holding it. It's difficult, but I have it. Stand by for retrofire." The engine cut off. The sudden, shocking silence was more terrifying than the burn. For Vladimir Komarov, the finality of it must have been absolute. He had done it. He had wrestled the tumbling, frozen beast, pointed it at a planet, and fired the retros. He was a cannonball he had aimed himself. There was no going back. He was, now, once again, a passive victim in a machine he knew was broken, falling from the heavens. He was still in darkness, still over the Pacific. For a few minutes, he just fell, silent, weightless. Then the first gentle breath of the upper atmosphere began to lick at the capsule. It was an imperceptible, ghostly drag, but it was the beginning. In the control bunker, they saw the telemetry. The retrofire was a success. The trajectory was perfect. A wave of stunned, cautious relief washed over the room. He did it. The man had actually done it. "He's coming home," someone whispered. Yuri Gagarin stood so still he seemed carved from stone, his eyes locked on the console that showed Komarov's altitude. Then, exactly as expected, the signal vanished. The telemetry screen dissolved into a wall of static. Komarov was gone. This was the other blackout. Not the cold, lonely blackout of orbital distance, but the hot, violent one. As the Soyuz plunged deeper, the friction of the air molecules it was hitting, at 28,000 kilometers per hour, began to superheat the atmosphere around it. The air itself was tearing apart, becoming a supercharged envelope of plasma, an impenetrable shroud of fire that no radio wave could escape. For Komarov, the world turned to hell. He wasn't just cold anymore, he was inside a furnace. The heat shield on his back was absorbing thousands of degrees of heat. He was no longer floating. The first whisper of drag became a shove, then a crushing, monstrous hand. But it wasn't the steady, controlled 3Gs of a normal re-entry. Because his orientation was manual, because his thruster fuel was spent, he wasn't flying like a sleek arrow. He was falling like a rock. It was a ballistic re-entry. The G-forces were not 3. They were 8. They were 9. They were 10. 10 times his own body weight. It was a crushing, brutal, bone-creaking load. He would have been unable to lift his hands, unable to turn his head.
His vision would have grayed out, his blood forced from his brain, consciousness itself just a tiny, flickering flame. The capsule wasn't gliding, it was shuddering. It was bucking and vibrating so violently, he was being slammed against his couch straps. Outside his tiny viewport, there was no blackness. There was only fire, a roiling, demonic orange and pink glow. He was inside the sun. And the sound, it was no longer silent. It was a primal, deafening shriek. It was the sound of the air itself screaming as he tore through it. He was inside a meteor, listening to the groans of a ship that had been flawed from the start. Is this where the plug burns through? He must have wondered, remembering the test flights. Is this where it all comes apart? In the bunker, they just waited. 10 minutes, 15. Gagarin was counting the seconds. This was the test. "Awaiting signal," the comms officer said, his voice flat. "Awaiting signal." Then a crackle, a pop, a high-pitched whistle, and through it all, a voice, distorted, gasping, but alive. "Zarya, this is Reuben. I am through. The grease are falling. I am through the fire. Altitude 10,000 meters. I am—" He was alive. He was subsonic. He was in the thick, safe air of the troposphere. He had survived the ice, the tumble, the power loss, the manual burn, and the fire. He had done the impossible. He was home. Now, all that was left was the one simple automatic system that had to work, the one he couldn't control: the parachutes. The transmission was a miracle. That gasping, ragged voice, ripped from the static, sent a convulsive shock of joy through the control bunker. He was alive. He was through. He had flown the re-entry by hand, endured a 10G ballistic nightmare, and survived the plasma shroud. He was at 10,000 meters, subsonic, falling through the sky over his homeland. He had done it. The superhuman part was over. Now all that was left was the automatic part, the simple, reliable sequence. Inside the capsule, Komarov was likely slumped, utterly spent. He was breathing heavily, his body a map of agony from the crushing G-forces. But he was alive. He had won. He would have checked his altimeter. 9,000 meters. He was falling, but that was the plan. Now he was just a passenger, waiting. At 7,500 meters, the sequence was programmed to begin. A barometric pressure sensor, detecting the proper altitude, was designed to send an electrical charge. This charge would fire a small pyrotechnic bolt, blowing the cover off the parachute compartment. Komarov would have heard it, a sharp, explosive clank from behind his head. A perfect sound. The first step was complete. The cover was gone. Immediately, a second pyro was meant to fire, deploying a small drogue chute. This wasn't the main parachute. It was a stabilizer, a pilot chute, designed to pull the spacecraft into the correct vertical orientation and, most importantly, to drag the massive main parachute from its container. He would have felt it, a sudden, sharp jolt that snapped the capsule straight. He was no longer just falling. He was being pulled. On his panel, a light would have confirmed, drogue deployed. This was it, the final moment. He was hanging from the drogue, stable, falling through the morning sky. In the bunker, they would have seen this on their telemetry. They were cheering. Gagarin was breathing again. He was safe. But Komarov was watching his velocity gauge, and it wasn't changing. The drogue was pulling, just as it was designed to, but it was pulling against an immovable object. The main parachute, the massive, life-saving 1,000 square meter canopy, was stuck. This was the flaw. This was the coarse and unreliable system from Rusayev's 10-page report. It wasn't a complex computer. It was a simple, stupid mechanical problem. The parachute container had been designed too small. The massive chute had been packed into it using hydraulic presses, jammed in like a brick. Then it had sat in the vacuum of space. It had frozen. It had been subjected to the enormous heat and G-forces of the ballistic re-entry, which had squeezed the container, compressing the packed chute even further. The nylon fabrics, packed under immense pressure and then baked, had fused. The drogue chute was pulling, but it wasn't strong enough. It was yanking on a block of nylon that was hopelessly, solidly wedged into its container. It would not, could not come out. Komarov knew. He was a pilot. He was watching his altimeter unwind, and he was watching his speed. 6,000 meters, 5,000 meters. He was still falling at hundreds of kilometers per hour. Zarya, his voice cut through the air, the exhaustion gone, replaced by a terrible, cold clarity. The main chute has not deployed. I repeat, the drogue is out, but the main has not deployed. I am falling. That single, calm transmission, "I am falling," was a blade that sliced through the control bunker, killing the last desperate flicker of hope. The cheers had turned to stone in their throats. They were looking at the altitude gauge, 5,000 meters, 4,500 meters. He was a stone. Yuri Gagarin, his face white, lunged at the console microphone, pushing the stunned comms officer aside. He slammed his hand on the transmit button. "Volodya, the reserve! Aktiviri zapasnoy! Activate the reserve chute now!" He was shouting at a man who was already in motion. Vladimir Komarov was not a passenger. He was a pilot to his last breath. He knew the procedure. His gloved hand, aching, brutalized by the G-forces, flew to the one last manual control he had left. It was a lever, a simple, physical, desperate switch. He didn't just pull it, he threw it. 4,000 meters. Outside the plummeting capsule, a second set of pyrotechnics fired. Clank! A different compartment, the one housing the smaller blue and white reserve parachute, was blown open. The chute was shot out, ejected by its own mortar, designed to blossom and save the day. But the drogue chute, the first one, was still there. This was the design flaw, the final, overlooked trap in a machine full of them. The drogue chute was still attached, flying straight above the capsule, still pulling on the main chute that was hopelessly jammed. It was a taut, strong nylon cable, streaming in the 100-meter-per-second wind. The reserve chute, when it fired, flew directly into it. It wasn't a gentle tangle, it was a high-speed collision. The reserve canopy, instead of filling with air, slammed into the lines of the drogue. It wrapped itself around them, a streamer of white fabric fouling a streamer of red. The two parachutes, one designed to save the other, became a single, useless, knotted mess. Komarov, inside, would have felt a jolt, but not the life-saving pull. It was a jarring, useless twitch. The capsule didn't slow. It may have even destabilized, beginning to spin on its axis. He looked at his velocity gauge. No change. He looked at his altimeter. 3,000 meters. 2,500 meters. The ground was no longer a map. It was a rapidly approaching wall. And in that moment, the discipline broke. The stoic pilot, the engineer, the soldier, it all burned away, leaving only the man who had been betrayed, the man who had accepted this mission to save his friend, knowing it was a trap. His voice exploded over the radio. It wasn't a gasp, it wasn't a report. It was a primal, human scream of pure, unadulterated rage. "The reserve is fouled!" he shouted, his voice distorting with the fury. "It's tangled! You did this! You knew! In the bunker, they were frozen. They were listening to a man live out his final seconds. He was cursing. He was naming the men who had signed the papers. He was screaming at mission, at the political officers, his voice a torrent of fury at the machine that had killed him. It was the raw, uncensored sound of a man betrayed by his own system. Gagarin was on his knees, his head in his hands, listening to his friend's final, terrible testament. It's 1,000 meters. The transmission was just noise now, just pure, agonizing sound.
And then, at 0724 local time, in the empty plains near Orenburg, silence. The line went dead. The agonizing scream was cut, replaced instantly by the flat, empty, soul-crushing hiss of an open channel. There was no more Komarov. There was only static. The static hissed. In the control bunker, no one moved. No one spoke. The flat, empty sound was louder than Komarov's final, furious screams. It was the sound of the end. Yuri Gagarin was a broken man, openly weeping at his console, his body shaking. The generals were pale, their military composure shattered. Vasily Mishin, the chief designer, looked like a man who had just seen his own ghost. The first frantic calls went out to the recovery teams, already airborne in helicopters, tracking the capsule's telemetry. They were expecting a landing, perhaps a hard one. They were not prepared for what they were tracking. The signal had abruptly vanished before the landing rockets, which were meant to fire just a meter above the ground to soften the impact, had even activated. When the recovery helicopter spotted the site, there was no celebration. There was only smoke. The capsule, carrying its full, unspent load of highly explosive peroxide for the soft landing engines, had struck the Earth at over 100 meters per second. It was not a landing. It was an impact. It was an explosion. When the first recovery crews landed and ran to the site, there was no capsule to open. There was no hatch to unbolt. There was only a crater, a mass of molten, unrecognizable metal, and a raging chemical fire. The Soyuz, the Union, had dug its own grave. The heat of the impact and the subsequent inferno had been so intense that there was nothing left to recover, just a few charred fragments, a scorched hole in the Russian steppe. The news hit Moscow like a physical blow. But the Soviet propaganda machine, a master of turning disaster into myth, went to work. TASS, the official state news agency, released the report. Cosmonaut Vladimir Komarov, hero of the Soviet Union, had completed his full flight program. During the final descent, a malfunction of the parachute system had resulted in a catastrophic end. He was a hero. He had perished in the line of duty. There was no mention of the solar panel, the power loss, the tumbling, the freezing, the manual re-entry, or the final betrayed screams of rage. The state gave him a state funeral. His indistinguishable remains were given a place of honor in the Kremlin wall. He was a martyr. But behind this wall of state-sanctioned grief, the program was in chaos, and one man was going to burn it all down to get to the truth: Gagarin. He was not just grieving, he was incandescent. He was done being a symbol. He and the other senior cosmonauts, like Alexei Leonov, effectively mutinied. They refused to fly. They refused to even train until they knew exactly what had happened. Gagarin, using the full, terrible weight of his fame, stormed into the investigation. This time, they couldn't just manage him. He was a man with nothing left to lose. The State Commission was formed, but Gagarin and the cosmonauts ran their own. Their first demand was simple, and it was brilliant. "You scrubbed Soyuz 2, they said. "The sister ship, the one he was supposed to meet. It's still on the launch pad. Open it." The order was given. Engineers at Baikonur, their hands shaking, went to the Soyuz 2 spacecraft, identical to Komarov's in every way. They unbolted the cover of the main parachute compartment. Then they tried to pull the parachute out. It wouldn't move. They pulled harder. It was wedged. They brought in a small crane. They attached it and pulled. With a horrible, tearing sound, the chute came out. It was a single, solid, fused brick of nylon, baked hard by the assembly plant ovens used to cure its container's lining. It never would have deployed. It could never have deployed. It was the proof. It was the coarse, unreliable flaw Veniamin Rusayev had written about. Komarov hadn't been the victim of a random, one-in-a-million failure. He was the victim of a systemic, catastrophic design flaw that was present in every single Soyuz they had built. The secrecy was broken. The accountability had begun.
The Soviet space program was grounded. It wasn't a suggestion, it wasn't a pause, it was a full, dead stop. The launch pads at Baikonur, which had been frantic with activity for the 50th anniversary push, fell silent. The entire Soyuz program, the future of their lunar ambitions, their space station plans, was frozen, locked down by the sheer, undeniable horror of Komarov's final, furious words and the molten crater in Orenburg. This time, there would be no quick, secret report. There would be no convenient scapegoats. The mutiny of the senior cosmonauts, led by a shattered and enraged Yuri Gagarin, had changed the rules. Gagarin, Leonov, and the others were now a permanent, brooding presence in the design bureaus. They haunted the assembly halls, their very silence a judgment. They sat in on every meeting, their eyes fixed on Vasily Mishin, who was now a man tasked with writing an engineering eulogy and then, somehow, resurrecting the corpse. The work began not with new designs, but with a brutal, systematic autopsy of the Soyuz 2 vehicle. The fused, solid brick of nylon they had ripped from its parachute container was the smoking gun. It was Exhibit A. The first and most damning realization was that the engineers had known. The container lining had been coated with a polymer resin, and the entire assembly was then baked in an oven to cure it. The heat from this curing process, combined with the immense pressure of the hydraulic packing, was what had welded the chute together. It was a manufacturing shortcut that had seemed fine on paper. The fix was agonizingly simple and a monument to their failure. First, redesign the container. They made it wider. They rounded the internal corners so there were no sharp edges to snag the fabric. Second, change the packing process. No more hydraulic presses. The parachutes were now to be packed by hand, carefully, with a new sequential folding method. Third, get rid of the goddamned resin. The new container was uncoated, just polished metal. Then they addressed the tangle, the second fatal flaw. The reserve chute had been fouled by the still-attached drogue. The solution was so obvious it was sickening. Cut the drogue free. A new piece of hardware was added, an explosive guillotine. The new logic was, if the main parachute does not deploy within X seconds, detected by a G-force sensor, a signal is sent. This signal first fires a bolt to sever the drogue chute, jettisoning it completely. Then, a second later, the reserve chute fires into clean, unobstructed air. But fixes on paper meant nothing. The program's new motto, born from Gagarin's fury, was distrust and verify. The testing began. They took the new parachute system, put it in a descent capsule, and threw it out of an airplane, over and over and over. They dropped it at high altitude. They dropped it at low altitude. They simulated tumbles. They simulated high-speed descents. They did all the tests they had skipped to meet the April deadline. Only after dozens of perfect, flawless deployments was the system even considered. The rest of the ship was torn apart. The stuck solar panel? It was redesigned with stronger pyrotechnic bolts and more powerful deployment motors. The erratic, power-hungry orientation system? It was ripped out. A new, redundant ion flow sensor system was installed, with smarter, more robust logic that wouldn't go insane if one part failed. Every single one of the 200 unresolved defects that Komarov flew with was addressed, one by one, until the list was empty. The Soyuz that finally flew again, over a year and a half later, looked the same on the outside, but it was a different machine. It was a ship built on shame, redesigned in anger, and reborn from a single, unignorable fact. The machines had failed, but the human element, Komarov's impossible piloting, and Gagarin's refusal to be silent, was the only thing that could save it. The 18-month silence was more than a technical grounding. It was a cultural exorcism. The Soviet space program, once driven by the reckless, intoxicating fumes of political deadlines, had been brought to its knees. The ghost of Vladimir Komarov and his final, furious, betrayed screams now haunted every design bureau, every assembly hall, and every control room.
A new phrase entered the lexicon, spoken first in whispers, then in meetings, and finally as an ironclad law. Don't fly for the sake of a date. It was the ultimate unwritten epitaph for Komarov. It was the lesson. It was the new religion. The 50th anniversary, the event for which Komarov had been sacrificed, had come and gone. The Kremlin had its parade, but the sky had remained stubbornly empty. The humiliation of that empty sky was nothing compared to the shame of the molten crater in Orenburg. The political leadership, for the first time, had been forced to confront a truth more powerful than their own authority. You cannot bully physics. The most profound shift, however, was in the power dynamic. The cosmonaut corps was no longer a collection of dutiful, patriotic pilots. They were now the program's ultimate and most unforgiving quality inspectors. They had a newfound, terrible power: the power of no. Yuri Gagarin, in the months after the disaster, had been the heart of this rebellion. He was a man transformed, his famous smile replaced by a cold, hard stare. He personally sat in on the redesign reviews, his presence a constant, burning reminder of what happened when warnings were ignored. He championed the engineers who spoke up, and he was merciless to the managers who had, in his eyes, signed his friend's death warrant. Tragically, Gagarin would never see the redesigned Soyuz fly. In March 1968, he himself perished in a routine and still deeply mysterious training flight in a MiG-15 jet. This second, incomprehensible loss cemented the new culture. The nation was now in mourning for both of its greatest space heroes. The system had sacrificed Komarov to a deadline and lost Gagarin to an accident? The paranoia and demand for safety became an all-consuming national obsession. They could not, would not lose a third. The Flight Readiness Review, once a rubber-stamp formality where political pressure outweighed technical data, became a brutal gauntlet. The power to stop a launch was no longer held just by the chief designer or the party bosses. It was given to the cosmonauts themselves. A new rule was instituted. The prime crew for a mission had the final sign-off. If they did not trust the ship, if they saw a single flaw they were not comfortable with, they could refuse to fly, and they would not be punished. They would be thanked. The culture of fear, the one that had forced engineers to sign off on flawed systems, was inverted. The new fear was not of missing a deadline. The new fear was of being the one who missed a flaw. The Veniamin Ruseyev report, once a career-ending act of insubordination, was now held up as the model of engineering integrity. The program had learned, in the most agonizing way possible, that the cost of honesty was survivable. The cost of silence was not. The news of Komarov's end filtered across the Iron Curtain not as a detailed report, but as a heavily censored, brutally simple fact. A Soviet cosmonaut, on a brand new spacecraft, had completed his mission but had perished during the return. It was an abstract, a ghost of a story. But in the United States, at NASA, they didn't need the details. They didn't need to hear the final, furious screams or see the fused brick of nylon. They understood. How could they not? In January 1967, just 3 months earlier, the American space program had been brought to its knees by its own funeral pyre. The Apollo 1 fire had claimed Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee before they ever left the ground. The engineers at Cape Kennedy were still living with the smell of smoke in their nostrils. They were still reckoning with their own culture of hubris, their own shoddy wiring, their own flawed checklists, their own lethal mistake of a pure oxygen atmosphere. And then came Soyuz 1. There was no celebration at NASA. There was no "we've pulled ahead." There was only a cold, profound, and empathetic dread. It was a moment of horrifying, mirrored humility. The two superpowers, locked in a race to prove their superiority, had both been stopped dead in their tracks in the same year by the same enemy, their own arrogance. The year 1967 became the crucible for all modern spaceflight safety.
It was the year the universe reminded both nations that space exploration is not a political game. It is a war against physics, and physics is an opponent that does not care about your flag. The lessons were brutal, and they were complementary. Apollo 1 taught the world, your machine can kill you before you even light the fuse. Your procedures, your materials, your very atmosphere on the ground are a part of the mission. Soyuz 1 taught the world, even if you do everything right in space, your final, simplest mechanical system can kill you. The last 10 minutes are just as dangerous as the first 10. This twin tragedy created a new, unwritten gospel of safety that transcended the Cold War. In the design bureaus of Houston and Huntsville, engineers looked at the scant reports from the USSR and began a paranoid re-examination of their own systems. Okay, our capsule fireproofed, they'd say. But what about our parachutes? What about our re-entry? The Soyuz 1 disaster forced NASA to triple-check the Apollo parachute system, to run countless more tests, to imagine failure scenarios they had previously dismissed as impossible. The legacy of Soyuz 1 is that it proved once and for all that the schedule is the deadliest enemy in spaceflight. Komarov's sacrifice became a permanent, spectral warning to all programs. It was a lesson that resonated 19 years later when NASA, having forgotten, pushed the Space Shuttle Challenger to launch on a cold morning to meet a political deadline. It resonated again in 2003 when Columbia was lost due to foam shedding, a problem that had been known, documented, and deferred. The cultural shift in the Soviet Union, don't fly for the sake of a date, eventually became a global mantra. Vladimir Komarov's tragic, lonely end was not just a Soviet failure. It was the first terrible payment, along with the Apollo 1 crew, for the ticket that would eventually take all of humanity to the moon and beyond. He and they did not die for their countries. They died for everyone. They were the first to show the world the true, non-negotiable price of admission to the cosmos.